I have the pleasure of talking with researcher and educator Ran Zwigenberg. Help me with your name, Ran.
Zwigenberg.
Zwigenberg.
Yeah.
Okay. And today we're talking about dark tourism and Ran's wonderful book about how the peace narrative or the global memory culture has developed over time. And you have so many amazing insights, Ran, in
Thank
this
you.
book. I'm sure we won't have time to discuss them all. And I would love to follow up in another interview about your work with Oleg about the
Yeah.
castles. Really
Oleg Benish. Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I first want to know, how did you get interested in this topic, which led you down this research theme?
Well, there's a couple of things that led me down to it. First of all, I'm from Israel, right? So I have my family. Most of my family, or most of my grandparents, are Holocaust survivors. And when I was in Hiroshima the first time, um, there was when I was here, I guess in 2004 or something. I was exchange student in Kyushu University in Fukuoka, where I'm right now, a visiting scholar, closing cycles and stuff. I went to Hiroshima, and then I remember feeling oddly, that I was there, everything was oddly familiar. The museum, the narratives, the way that it was designed, but also even the people. I had a chance to go listen to a survivor, and it felt oddly like my own grandparents talking. And there's something about the clothing, the atmosphere, the story itself, that really touched me in a very emotional way, even though it's a completely different place, completely different event. So when I started doing my grad work in New York at the University of New York, I did a research, just exploring. I did a research paper. I didn't want to write on this or anything like this. I started doing more German history, something more related toward German history, intellectual history. Um, and then my advisor at the time said, "Why don't you write more about us?" And I wasn't interested, but they were really pushing me, and luckily so. So eventually I took it on, and the more I got into it, the more I understood how many connections there are between my own personal history and the story of Holocaust survivors and commemoration of the Holocaust and commemoration of Hiroshima. So this is why the book eventually became a global memory, because about global memory, because it's basically about how we all share some of the same tropes, some of the same narratives, some of the same symbols and understanding of how we deal with such a momentous and horrible events that happened in World War II. Because World War II, after all, we forget, is a world war, right? We all kind of look at it through the lens of our own little national histories. I teach in America, and most Americans, of course, think about Hiroshima through the American lens, either for or against dropping the bomb, or uh, was it or what happened afterwards, depends on your political persuasions, right? Uh, but it's much more than this. It's a global event. Both of those were global events and touch well beyond the communities in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the communities affected by the Holocaust. So that was basically what led me into this research. And I can talk more about details later on, but it was kind of a combination of personal history and my advisors insisting that it's going to be good to do it. Like no one ever did it before,
Yeah.
so I took it on.
No, it's really powerful and it's really complicated. I
Yeah.
often work in tourism in Hiroshima for many years now, and the peace narrative is always in conflict with owning the military history and having that balance of the dark past and the
Yeah.
bright future. And you lay these issues out so clearly, but also show how complicated
Thank you.
it is, from the survivors, from the politicians, from the design of the park. There's so many different parts of it which have created the modern experience that people have when they come to Hiroshima. It's really and a great resource. You wrote it
Thank
many
you.
years ago. How long did it take you to research the book, to get it done?
Just I first came serious research, I guess, started in 2008, finished the book, the dissertation 2012, 2013, and then another year until it came out. I did a book very fast because the week I defended my first, we realized that my wife's pregnant. So I had to hurry up because I knew I wouldn't have any time to work on this. So basically, it was written, the book itself was written during this time, but the research took about 4 to 5 years. Um,
Were you
yeah, and
in Hiroshima during that time?
I was in Hiroshima 2000, I can't remember, 2008 and 9, I guess. Then I came back a couple of times. A lot of this is also done in other countries. So a bunch of archives and archive visits and museums and trips around Europe, Poland, Germany mostly. Then American research and in Israel, in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem. So um, it took a lot of dots to be, especially when you start to follow the connections between Hiroshima and the Holocaust, Hiroshima and Auschwitz. We can talk about it later about this particular connection. There's a lot of traveling involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like your mic has a little bit of feedback. Something,
Okay.
it's,
Okay. Because
yeah.
I'm on my. All right. So where do I do it?
I'm not sure. There, it sounds like the static has started with the mic. I'm not sure why.
Because I'm with those earphones, right? So I don't know if the mic is from the earphones or from the
I don't know.
iPad. So
It sounded fine in the beginning, and then the
is
static
it better
started.
now?
No, same
Have
static.
have echo cancellation, noise cancellation, audio input, output. Better now?
Now that's better. That's better.
Wait, but it's also I can't hear you from now. It's okay, or it
Yes,
just
yes, that's
it's okay
good
now.
now. Yep.
All right. Okay. I just
Is that
changed the input.
okay? Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Cool. All
Yeah.
right. Sorry about that.
No, no,
Uh,
no problem.
where were we?
Just talking
Don't remember.
about your research. You were in Hiroshima for about 5 years. You said research
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
and
I wrote
around
within
the
5 years.
world.
Yeah. Around
Hmm.
the world. Yeah. It's a lot of a lot of travel. Yeah.
Yeah.
On very
Um,
tight budget also.
but one of the things that really struck out to me is how the whole narrative of peace is very, it's complicated, right? Even now
Yeah.
we see this, it's complicated. You want to talk about um, how the city was destroyed and has this fresh start, is a very common narrative,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah.
rebirth.
The rebirth, yeah, it got under the occupation. It got into what we now will see as surreal. It's very hard. I mean, the picture you show, it's from a tourist guide, and I think it's from '51. I might be wrong, but it's still under occupation. And to put on your tourist guide a picture of the atomic bomb, it's a little bit jarring for our eyes, but it was very. It was something you see a lot at the time because tourism, we talked about tourism a little bit before, about was a very big driver of this change, and it gets a lot to get to do with money then and now. And I'm not talking in the cynical look at them; they're benefiting from the disaster kind of narrative, but really, people were starving. People had no. There was no 80% of the tax base of Hiroshima City was destroyed. Right, the city was oriented towards war production. I mean, all of Japan was in a bad way, but Hiroshima in particular, both the actual destruction of Hiroshima, right, but also the economic destruction, then transfer from war economy to peace economy, and the fact that a lot of people were killed, a lot of factories and source of income destroyed, and the city was badly needed sources of income, right? So tourism was one action resource that I talk about to rebuild a city. rebuild a city, because what they figure out very fast, I mean, Hiroshima City and other people who work in tourism here, is that people come to see this place. And I think there was one guide that I found in a museum from 1946 that called the city the Atomic City. And it's basically telling what everybody knows. Everybody come here to see the bomb. And it's something that people can literally capitalize on, like get money for rebuilding the city. And then there was the ideological / political issue here. Ideological meaning there is an emphasis on a move from war to peace, right? And in all of Japan, there's an emphasis on a new beginning, a new fresh start after the war, right? It's also very convenient because they don't really want to talk about what happened, right? It's not even, it's hard not to be cynical, but we have to remember to look at it from the eyes of people at the time, right? A terrible war happened. They were complicit in it in so many ways. The Americans came, defeat. Everything has to be rethought of. Everything has to be reevaluated. And the Americans basically give them this gift, right? And saying, here, there's a new start. Now it's a democracy. Now it's a place of peace. Now you're a nation of peace, right? There's a peaceful constitution and everything. Now it's a fresh start. And there's kind of an agreement between both the American occupiers and Japanese elites that are constructing this narrative, not to talk too much about what happened, but to talk about the future, about Hiroshima's role in the new order as a place that is a warning and a place which can work for peace. And this is something that you can say that starts even as early as August 15 with the emperor decree that ended the emperor speech that ended the war. He said that there's this horrible weapon the enemy is deploying, and now we have to surrender to save civilization. I don't remember the exact wording, but it didn't present the end of the war as a complete failure on parts of Japanese elites. I don't even talk about what happened in Asia, right? In Japan's aggression and everything, and Nanking. It's about towards the Japanese people, right? The Japanese elites completely, criminally persecuted a war that led to 3 million and more dead, right? And now they have this God-given ideological gift from the Americans saying, "Oh, there's a bomb, and now we surrendering in order to save the world." So it was very easy to transition in Hiroshima to this, okay, we now save the world kind of peace narrative. And also, going to the politics here, the Americans would not let them talk about a bomb any other way. I mean, I'm reducing very complicated situation here, but basically, you couldn't talk about a bomb in any other way but in connection to peace, right? So you have all those different narratives, right? I mean, I started tourism, but tourism, of course, it comes afterwards. But like the tourism, the ideological, the political, the economic, all the things lead to this narrative that the bomb ended the war and gave Japan a new beginning. And this specifically in the beginning, right, tied to very specific history in Hiroshima also, which is the history of militarism and history of identity of the city as a gunto or military city. Hiroshima is not the only gunto. There are many other cities that were base towns in Japan. It's got a lot to do with the fact there is a castle in the middle of Hiroshima that was a huge base. We can talk about the absence of military depth in narratives and everything afterwards, but it's something that was at the beginning start as, the bomb has destroyed all of this and washed away our sins. A very Christian kind of narrative, again, American Christian narrative. And there's beginning acknowledgement that we move away from this, right? So all of those things led to this narrative eventually. And my surprise when I wrote the book, and even throughout those years, I mean, I wrote a whole bunch of things afterwards on tourism, or specifically in a castle and militarism, how much of a staying power it has. It is amazing how much, even when the occupation ends, people don't talk about how cruel the Americans are. They talk about how cruel the bomb was, but it's the bomb, right? The Americans are completely out of the picture. So, and I have, in the book, I talk a little bit about why, but it's really amazing the staying power of this narrative.
It really is. Your microphone is acting up again. Can you do the magic you did before?
Yeah, I think it's I'll have to take off the earphones.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Um,
We had a comment from Alicia Gibson, two of my
yeah.
favorite people having an important
Hi, Alicia.
conversation. Thanks, Alicia. Great to have you here. How is that? Can you hear? Okay.
Yeah, I think
Oh,
it wouldn't allow me to split the audio to an input and output, so I
it's
have the
better
noise.
without the static.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's better.
okay. Usually it's
Um,
the other way, but yeah,
Yeah, the really, and I'm sure I've read this. I read your book years ago and then reviewing it again before this talk. The thing that is really powerful to me is the hibakusha experience, the development of how survivors became peace activists and how
yeah,
their stories were often censored. And then now the modern narrative is their stories are very key to the visitor experience coming to the Peace Park.
yeah,
You talk about this development so well in the book, and it is very complicated, and it comes from many different directions.
yeah. It's that's a later. The voice of the survivors come out. It's a later. In the beginning, this relates to Alicia's question, right? Like, in the beginning, there are not many avenues for survivors to talk about it. Well, so let's start from the fact that in the beginning, Hiroshima was not so different from other places. And we tend to forget that before Hiroshima, there was a huge campaign that destroyed almost all of Japan's urban environment. We're talking numbers like 60, 50%, Toyama 99%, 100,000 people in Tokyo, more than the bomb initially, right, in Tokyo in March 10. Um, so people in Hiroshima look around and their city destroyed in one blast. But before people are aware of what happened with radiation, and even if they are, there is censorship and people are not allowed to talk about it openly, all of this stuff, right? Even medical research is suppressed because it's military secret. Um, People cannot really talk about it. There are local publications that people start talking about what happened, people start sharing, but it's a community thing. Another thing, all right, so this is throughout all Japan. It's not a very unique experience to begin with. There's a censorship that keeps it down, right? And also very fast, Hibakusha and are becoming a minority in Hiroshima proper. Hiroshima was the gateway to the Japanese Empire before the war, during the war, okay, before and during the war, and gateway to people coming back. The city is flooded with people coming back. And for this and for various other reasons, uh, Hiroshima survivors become actual minority in the city. A lot of them also didn't want to stay in Hiroshima for various reasons. And they start to see discrimination against survivors in all sorts of ways. They're becoming a problem population. I talk a lot about it in my new book about trauma. We can talk about it later also. Anyway, this, but particularly more strongly the censorship, right, did not allow people to come out and talk openly about what happened. There's also psychological issues. People don't want to talk about things happening. You have the very, very similar situation with the Holocaust. The first 10 years, there is talk about, people do talk, but there's no public talk. There's private talk. But publicly, it's not acceptable to talk about it. There's also the question of representation. How do you talk about it? What words do you use? It's unprecedented, right? And again, going back to the new beginning, people don't want to hear, right? They don't want to talk about what happened. They don't want to talk about the war, right? People are more concerned, and it's also privately with people. I remember I read I read a lot of files for my last book of social workers that work with young hibakusha, and we don't think about hibakusha as young, right? I mean, but of course they're young, right? It just happened, right? And you have all those people, all those students. Like I remember one case of a student who's like, I have a keloid on my feet, and it's like the only thing that kind of bothers her, right? She's like, I can't wear dance shoes. It really bothers her. She can't wear dance shoes. She want to go out dancing. And I never thought about hibakusha like this, but actually, of course, I mean, why would they want to talk about it, right? Why do you want to bring back this? You want those people, a lot of them were young, they want to enjoy life, they want to live after all those years of of suffering, right? So all those things, both psychologically and politically and the social environment, meant that people didn't really talk about it until around about the mid 50s. You start to have more Abombed literature, Abombed poets, people start talking about it. But not until 52, 53, and I guess even 55, you don't have the idea of people coming out and talking about it for peace. And this connection is important, right? The talking about the bomb, not just about the bomb per se, but connecting it for anti-nuclear activism. And this is where this whole idea of a testimony, giving a testimony, started. Again, people are starting to collect testimonies already from the late 40s. This also connects to peace activism, but it only come out really big nationally, not just in Hiroshima and Nagasaki proper, in the mid 50s. And this is where the anti-nuclear movement, after what's called the Lucky Dragon 5 incident, when Japanese fishermen are victims of nuclear H-bomb testing in a bikini in island Pacific, that's gone wrong. Not wrong. It goes a little bit too successful and engulfed the Japanese fishing vessel. There's radioactive rain falling in Tokyo, and there's a big anti-nuclear movement coming out of it. And in this context, actually, the first time people come out on the stand and say war is bad while crying. And this is in a book I called Emotional Mobilization. And again, I don't want to be cynical about it, because this has really helped a lot of hibakusha deal with this, to tie to the political mobilization. There's the silver lining issue, right? They had such a horrible thing happening to them, and they can now get something good coming out of it, right?
Yeah.
So this whole idea of like, it's good that I stayed alive to tell this story, right?
Yeah. They have purpose. They have
purpose. Yeah.
It's productive. It's useful. They're sharing their experience. It also seemed around the mid 50s was when they started talking. Survivors would work with lawyers as well as activists and try to get compensation.
Yeah,
I was surprised how long it took them to get medical and financial support from the government.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk for 2 hours about this. This is not what it's mainly about, but it's.
Sorry, Ran, your microphone sounds strange again.
Okay, sorry. Is it better now? I'm closer to the.
It's still it has that staticky, and then when you reset it before, it seemed to fix it.
Okay, audio.
I'm so sorry. Just to let everybody know, Ran has had trouble logging in this morning. He's now using a secondary device, so please bear with us. Thank you so much.
I apologize. I don't really know.
No. Okay, that sounds better. Yeah,
okay, good.
Sounds better.
We'll just keep playing with the audio.
Yeah.
Okay. So compensation, right? So Noah Akiko, other people wrote about it in connection with the hibakusha movement, and they did really great work. It's not like my major topic, but the connection is both to peace, the abstract idea of not abstract. I mean, it's very real at the time. It's the height of the Cold War, right? And the very real and direct issue of compensation. Now, in the beginning, hibakusha and other people who were victims of the bombing are not separate. Also, their organization leader, the same organizations. Only about the time in 1948, 1949, when this first, and I should have mentioned at the first question about the city, there is a law, right, passed by the Japanese government under the occupation, the blessing of occupation, making Hiroshima a peace city and Nagasaki a culture city. That's in Chad Deal, and other people wrote about it, why Nagasaki gets the culture and Hiroshima gets the peace. Again, a whole different conversation. But this law is not for the survivors. It's for the city. It's for commemoration. It's for building this museum. Right? The survivors don't get anything. And around the same time, they start organizing and say, given what happened with radiation, again, they can't talk about it openly, but giving the symbolic impact of Hiroshima, we're different from the other bombing victims. And that's a very complicated, very difficult move to make, because what makes Hibakusha different, that he lost all of his family, different from someone who's quote unquote regular bombing, lost all his family, right? And actually, you have a conversation with people coming out saying, I lost an eye to regular bombing, guy from Nagoya, right? Like, what makes me different than you? I mean, they're actually confronting each other. I'm quoting from memory here, so. And it's difficult, but Hibakusha organization have issues, and Hibakusha have issues that others don't have, namely radiation disease, and they're having to deal with this unknown disease, right? And this actually allowed them to both claim special compensation and allow the government an opening to somehow compensate them, because the government is terrified from opening the door of compensation. The government compensate after the occupation over, right? Veterans, people who lost property, right, in the continent, again, people who lost property due to occupation land reform. They don't want to compensate, and people who are connected to the government, so government workers, they don't want to compensate in any way civilian casualties of war. They don't want to open this gate, right? And Hibakusha have to press on this gate and have to have political mobilization to press on this gate. And to find this political power and a political movement that can allow for compensation through the peace movement. But the peace movement is leftist, the government is rightist. There's a lot of politics involved, and there's a lot of pushing. And in the beginning, it only gets a little bit in 1956, and every time they have to fight for more and more and more, and there's more and more revisions. And even it's up to this day. Only last year there is a ruling, which I'm sure you know about the Black Rain survivors. They always have to fight for more and more recognition, and recognition again is from the Japanese government, not from the American government. The Americans wouldn't pay them a dime, right? Even though, you know, in the Holocaust case, well, we can't stand any comparisons here, but let's just talk about compensation. Survivors get compensation from the German government, right? So again, this makes this whole case of Hiroshima pretty complicated, and explains those delays,
Yeah.
I guess.
And in terms of the funding that the American government would do, like for development of the Peace Park, that kind of brings us to the Atoms for Peace
Yeah,
exhibit. And that was a big controversy because the government came in with all these nuclear power is wonderful exhibits
yeah,
and actually replaced a lot of the artifacts that were in the Peace
yeah,
Memorial. And then locals were saying, why do you have money for this, but you don't have money to compensate the
yeah,
local survivors,
yeah.
right?
It's
So
even crazier. Okay, it's
crazy.
a really crazy story. And before I wrote my second and third book, in between the second and various times, I'm just going to write about this story. Um, then Fukushima happened. It's a whole different angle here. So yeah, this picture from the museum. Right, 1949, 48. There is money from the Japanese government, right? It's not American money, to build Hiroshima as a peace city, Nagasaki as a culture city, right? Now, again, the money goes to symbolic commemoration, peace, and all this stuff. Important, not survivors, right? This money built the Peace Park, built the museum. For a time, it's the biggest construction project in Japan. And this is built inside a city of shacks. I mean, we can't even
Sorry,
imagine.
Ran, your
In my
microphone just
okay,
went weird again.
okay. Let's do this dance again. All right.
Little
Audio.
dance to get it back.
Is it
Okay.
better now?
Yep,
Good.
sounds good.
All right. Yeah. So. Okay. So. Uh, it's hard for us to imagine the contrast, right? Because we now see New Hiroshima, where the Peace Park is different from the surrounding city, but it's kind of architecturally and conceptually, it's not so different from the building around us. By the time you see pictures, it's built on top of a slum, basically, along the rivers, right? All through what's now Nakajima, there's basically a slum. There's a slum that goes all the way to Motomachi, to the castle and beyond. towards Hiroshima. What is all now public housing around the castle, it was all a slum, extending all the way down to Nakajima. People built houses wherever they could, and then they basically throw everybody out and say that's a park now, right? Again, money, commemoration, okay, it's all towards the symbolic, right? Less about people's life, right? And Nishi Marina wrote brilliantly about this connection, about what reconstruction mean in Hiroshima, and what it mean is for people or for something else. And it's something else that really what pushed Atom for Peace, because Atom for Peace basically is a propaganda campaign, and Bo Jacobs and others also, and other people wrote about it, that basically try to make the atom look good. And what's a better way to make the atom look good? And go straight to the source, to Hiroshima. So the American government, and American diplomats and other people in Japan goes to Hiroshima, goes to Hiroshima leadership, Hamai Shinzo, the mayor, and others, and say, let's put an Atom for Peace exhibit in Hiroshima. Atom for Peace, showing that the bomb is not the only face of the atom, also atomic energy. Atomic energy can save the world, can lead this limitless energy, right? This is the dream of space travel and futuristic technology, right? This is the technology of the future. This is again the space age, satellites, Sputniks, all this stuff, right? Is all tied to Atoms for Peace and to the promise of the atom. And actually, Hiroshima leadership, including many in the survivor leadership, embrace it. Why? Because there's a symbolic move from dark bomb, bright atom, bright future. Again, let's think about the future. And they say, let's not use atom for war, but use it for peace. So there is very wide consensus among most, and this including the left also, because the Soviets doing the same thing, right? They have their own atom for peace, that we should embrace atomic energy and not atomic bombs, right? They make this separation. So it's relatively easy for Americans and their Japanese counterparts, Japanese government and other business and others, to push for atomic exhibit inside the museum, right? There's only one problem: is there are other things in the museum when they try to put it. So they decide to take everything out, the 2,000 pieces, up 2,000 artifacts, and put the Atoms for Peace exhibit instead of it. But this actually made some in the Bakshan movement really angry.
Yeah.
And I wrote about it in a couple of articles.
Yeah. And in your book, you say these 2,000 artifacts represent the lives of 200,000 people that were lost. How can they replace it with American propaganda?
That's what
really
they say.
Shocking, right?
Yeah, that's what the survivors say, because they see through the American move basically and saying we're trying. And what's even more crazy, right? I wanted to end with this. This was just the start. They wanted to build a nuclear reactor in Hiroshima. Just imagine what happened if Fukushima happened in Hiroshima again.
No, because recently you do hear Hibakusha survivors who are still alive or active in the peace movement now. They feel a connection to Fukushima survivors, people who have had radiation in Fiji and other parts of the world. They really feel part of this global community who have suffered radiation in any way. So looking back on this, they didn't know that there were going to be disasters at that time, but it seems crazy, right?
For us, again, it's very hard for us to put us in this position of the mid-50s, and because we know about Fukushima, we know about Chernobyl, we know about 3 Mile Island, we know about all this bad history of nuclear weapons. We know what tests did. We know there's radiation everywhere, right? Bo Jacobs' recent book, Nuclear Bodies, show how widespread is radiation everywhere. We know about this now. We don't know enough, but at the time, it was relatively easy for one decide to support nuclear energy, and again, it was a consensus to push it as something that is the other bright side of. And to put Hiroshima as the first site of a nuclear reactor had a lot of symbolic meaning to it, and also it was supposedly an economic bonanza, and the Hiroshima leadership supported this. Now, there was no reactor eventually, luckily, right, in Hiroshima.
Yeah.
But I just listened to a talk by Ida Kaori.
Sorry,
About
Ran, the
my mic
microphone is
again, yeah.
doing it again.
All right, let's do this dance again.
I'm so sorry.
It's moving from like iPhone to okay.
Okay, yeah.
So Ida Kaori wrote now about how Hiroshima University is actually pushing for a research reactor that they do have. And what they want to do is, again, it's about symbolic capital and actual capital. They want to show Hiroshima should be the place for radiation research in Japan. And the ABCC, the research apparatus that America put in Hiroshima, is supporting it. So eventually they did get a reactor, but it's a small one in Hiroshima University. But there's all this push to capitalize on the fact that Hiroshima is associated with a nuclear. And it's not only come from America. I don't want to make it an American position. It goes two ways. There's many people in Hiroshima that are pushing either for a reactor or for nuclear research or for atoms for peace. It's a joint enterprise in a way.
Yeah, so interesting. You talk a lot about the design of the park, and it's the first time it was such a modern. This goes with the same narrative about the rebirth of a new city, redesigning it as modern. I think this also feeds into the idea of using nuclear power as a better future, right?
Yeah.
But the Peace Park itself and all the greenery along the rivers and everything, and having that combination, the clear line between the Abombed Dome, the cenotaph, the museum. And yesterday I was at the Nakaku incineration plant, and they also
Great
connect
place.
to the line.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's why
Wow.
that incineration plant is separated into two sides, so that there's no separation from the peace line all the way to the sea.
Wow, I never thought about it. It's a very Shinto kind of, you have the Shinto gates that go from the sea to the inner shrine. Yeah, I never connected this garbage plant to. It's a great place, right?
But also having that connection with nature. There were a lot of different design ideas. At one point, the local businesses wanted a zoo in the Peace Park. That's interesting.
There was a hotel there, right? So
there was a hotel. One of the Kenzo Tange's buildings was used as a hotel.
Yeah, and that's where she stayed, Hiroshima Monomura, the French woman. Her name.
So the way we experience Peace Park and Hiroshima City Center now, it's not been a straight line. It's been a real back and forth development over time from a lot of different forces.
Yeah, it was, again, it's all about symbolic capital, and there's more, and the atomic bomb dome, and the park are the most important spaces for the city. If you go to Hiroshima Station, there's a big signs leading you straight to the atomic bomb dome. That's where you take the tram straight there. There's a big sign. I don't know if it's still there because they took down the station, right? I remember there's like the first thing I saw. I remember when I went out of the train in Hiroshima was a sign of the dome and like leading you to the tram. I just in the old station. I don't know if they still have it. It's like you literally led straight from there. This is very pilgrimage vibe to it, and the people who designed the city and designed the museum, that was their intention, right? You don't go to the museum from the back, right? You go always from the dome, right? All the visitors go from the dome, and this was how it was designed. Tange Kenzo, they designed both the city. You have to remember, Hiroshima was completely destroyed, and it was seen as an opportunity to build a new modern city, not just Nakajima, right? To rebuild the whole city. That's why we had those enormous 100-meter, like the Peace Avenue, right? Like 100-meter avenues, and the bridges that connect to it. Everything was designed with an intention to make a new peace city, a new modern city. And this intention was to make it into a site of pilgrimage. Now, I write in the book that was actually built on earlier designs. We mentioned Shinto shrines. It was actually on purpose because the earlier design that he had was for a shrine commemorating the death of Japanese soldiers in the war. And it was a wartime, very triumphant commemoration of people who died for the Greater East Asia War. And he took the same design and changed it into the Peace Park design, right? That was, I think, like in the 80s. They found the old 80s. I forgot the name. This Japanese historian found it, but so this it tells you a story, right? You go out from the tram. Usually, if you go out from the tram, go in front of the dome, you're in the destruction part, right? And then you go in straight line from the destruction part through this park. It's full of nature, right? This idea of that will be a place of nature, of water, of life, right? And you go to this very solemn place, the cenotaph, where the names are written, and there it's underneath, but it's like where you give your prayer, and then you go up into this very modern building, right? So it's from destruction to rebirth, right? It's a very very particular story, but the fact that they designed like this, and eventually the city and the park they managed to preserve like this, was not a foregone conclusion because it was a place where a lot of people had a lot of ideas of what to do with, right? Either the hotel,
Sorry,
the kind of
microphone.
microphone. Why is it going back to the?
No, it's like it gets tired. It goes back to static. Okay, it's better now.
I set it up in I'm gonna write an angry email to Apple. Right, where was I?
So,
Okay, so
from destruction to modern rebirth through the park.
yes, that's it. Yeah, and that's a very common trope in commemoration. You have the same thing in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, um, where you go to the depth of the war, and then you go up and you go up, and it's literally open up into the open air and the mountains of Jerusalem, and they're like Israeli flags, and again, rebirth. That's a very, very common trope when you talk about commemorating disaster, and it's Tangekens of basically the same thing. But again, other people had other ideas, right? We talk about the zoo, it's one of them, but also this was the biggest park in Hiroshima, and as such, it was a place for gathering, either for young bike gangs. I talk about how it was a place for people running around with their little scooters, right, and having parties, which people didn't like at all, or for student radicals, or for labor radicals, or for army, self-defense forces, parades. There were military ceremonies done in the Peace Park in the 70s. There were actually tanks on Peace Boulevard. How ironic, but from 67 or 68 to 73, I think the oil shock ended it. There were military parades on Peace Boulevard that ended with a ceremony in front of the cenotaph.
Wow.
And all of this now, it's a history that, again, there was a whole movement in the 60s and 70s by the city to sort of sanctify the peace movement and get rid of the students, get rid of the bad gangs, get rid of the hibaksha that were selling unauthorized souvenirs. There used to be all those shacks of people selling souvenirs, of making it properly clean and presentable, right? But it took a long time, up until the mid 70s, even the 80s, to get it to its current form today.
So interesting. When I do tours through Peace Park, I often talk about the different memorials that are in there and how each memorial has a big group of grassroots movement to get it there. For example, even the children's monument with Sadako Sasaki, that took a lot of petitions and a lot of rallying to get that in there. And so I always point out every single thing in here has been a battle to get it here, and it has deep meaning and deep connection to the local people who wanted it here. And I think that's something not to take lightly for the design, for the memorials, for everything, right?
Yeah, and I always use, when I teach, I always use the Korean one. I think the easiest one to talk about, the one that's most obvious one, is the Korean memorial that you have
with the turtle. Yeah,
the turtle. Yeah, the one towards the top of the island. which is a little bit out of sight. I write in a book, and again, I think Lisa, either
Hmm.
Lisa Onayama or Naono Akiko, I think it's Naono Akiko, wrote a really nice article about how it used to be outside
Yeah.
because the city would not allow a Korean memorial because, well, they wouldn't say it, but it was a Japanese strategy. No, no Koreans need apply, right? It's the Korean Japanese and Koreans were discriminated at the time, still discriminated to a large extent, and even in death. But there's a larger story here because there is a big fight between North Korea and South Korean Association about who is going to own this site. The memorial is not for the Korean people; it's for a prince who was very inconveniently for Korean nationalists, not Korean nationals, not nationalists, patriots. Um, Also a lieutenant, I think, in the Japanese army. So he died as a Japanese soldier in Korea, and memorial is for, and of course, it's something that communists will not approve of, right? Memorial for the prince and not for the people. So it's a long time of fighting between the Koreans, and the city didn't want to anything to do with this. I mean, that's the city point of view. So there's a lot of story behind this particular memorial, and and it's the thing with monuments, and specifically with the park, it looks so set and so, and the atmosphere is so sacred and respectable. But we think that it was always like this. But as you said, every single thing there have politics and history behind there.
Yeah.
And
I read about that memorial that it wasn't moved into the park until the early 90s. So
94,
it's
yeah,
quite, yeah, recent development, right?
yeah. In 94, there were the Asia Games. And again, don't quote me on this. I think it's got a lot to do with the fact there's a lot of Koreans and Asians coming in, and this also got to do with the renovations of the exhibit to be a little bit more acknowledging of Japanese history and of aggression in Asia. A lot got to do with the people who come to see, because the more and more tourists coming from outside what used to be just Euro Americans,
Yeah.
outside the usual groups of Japanese and Euro Americans, and a lot of tourists from Asia, meaning that you have to acknowledge their stories as well. So there's a lot of dialogue between the groups,
Yeah.
between the
Your
yeah.
your microphone again
Yeah,
said,
let's go
um,
back.
yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's the museum itself had just been renewed in the last couple years. That was a criticism of many visitors from abroad, saying there wasn't enough ownership of Japan's military role, as a reason, perhaps, that it was bombed, not just that the bomb happened out of nowhere. It
yeah,
seems like there's a more balanced view with the modern revival.
yeah, yeah. That's the first. The recent revision in the 2010s, 14 to 18, is actually the second round of controversy, debate, talks about what to do with Japanese past. Uh, the first one was the mid 90s, the 50th anniversary of the war, and then there is a talk about the Kagaisha corner, the aggressors corner, that the museum wanted to put in, but then the right wing in Hiroshima didn't really like it, said it's going to scar our children if they know about what Japan did. Uh, it's a long it's a long story in Japan about how the right wing doesn't want to acknowledge any Japanese crimes, and as you know, you've probably been to the museum many times. It's basically a panel. You know, it's like panel two. It's not so conspicuous, but even this, I would say, token acknowledgement of Hiroshima role. It's like one corner here, right? There's a panel or two about Nanking. I might be wrong because I haven't been there for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more? You remember? I think there's
It's
a
a
corner in the
panel or
end.
two. It's not a huge
Yeah,
section, but it does acknowledge it, which is a
yeah,
big improvement, I think.
yeah, yeah. Before,
And this was part of the controversy about the A-bombed warehouses, which they've just
yeah,
decided to preserve. But
yeah, it's a great, great picture.
how do you own the military past with places like that and
Yeah,
the Peace Park? And I really believe, and I think many people do, and I'm so glad it's being preserved. You need both. You need
yeah.
to have both, right?
You need to acknowledge that history is not simple story. It's layered history, and specifically in the case of Japan, it was an aggressor country. It did horrible things. I mean, countries don't do it. People, Japanese people, Japanese army, Japanese politicians did horrible things in Asia that they have to own up to if they want to keep living in this neighborhood, right? I mean, it's. And then, of course, on the other hand, Japanese were also victims of U.S. bombing of the atomic bomb. And those two things, I mean, history can show both of those things. You have to show the layers. And to go to those warehouses, right? They were saved as an A-bombed building, right? And the way they talk about it now is an A-bomb building, right? I would like them to be saved as a historical building with a connection to Japanese militarism as well. And Japanese military and the very particular local history of Hiroshima as a military city, and a city that really connected its identity very, very strongly with the empire and with the military, where it was one of the main gateways to go to the Russo-Japanese War, Sino-Japanese War. That's something that should be more acknowledged side by side. Right? Of course, they don't cancel each other, but right now the bomb, in a way, right, intentionally or not, cancel those other histories. And in this, if to preserve those warehouses, you should have acknowledgement of those two histories. But right now, there's an erasure. It's not complete in other places. For example, in a castle, they did a really good job. They have a number of exhibitions talking about the fact that it was a military site. But you will notice, for example, if you go to the castle, and I think you had a tour for there a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
It's very easy to miss the bunkers that still exist.
Yeah.
Right? There's a line of trees that are very conveniently put there that hide them. It is acknowledged, and there's a sign, but you have to actually go behind the trees. And what you have conspicuous in front of you is like this big, beautiful tenshu that now they're going to destroy. And then the nation protecting shrine, which is a whole different story, right? A very right-wing shrine, but it's the military history is literally hidden, and I think there should be an acknowledgement of this, because this will lead to, by preserving those things properly and talking about it properly, will lead to a much more acknowledgement of the complex history of the place.
Yeah. And that bunker next to in the castle grounds is really interesting, because that's where the young girl who was working there made the first call to the headquarters and saying, we have been destroyed in Hiroshima by a new kind of bomb. And, that finally led to the leadership, and maybe that was part of the resignation by the government that they needed to give up.
It's a historic place, both for the history of the bomb itself, but also for the larger history. It was, there's one thing that really I always miss in the Hiroshima narrative: the stories of soldiers and the place of the military. It's complex. It's hard to acknowledge this, but the bomb was of course dropped on a civilian city. It was only dropped a couple hundred meters from one of the largest military camps in Western Japan. It's the site of the Second Army. There are thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers there. There's tens of thousands of soldiers were hibakusha, yet you very rarely hear their stories. And I have a friend who worked on this in Nagasaki, and she went and interviewed the people in Iwate Prefecture that were victims both of Hiroshima and Fukushima, because they were soldiers at the time. Right? They went down to Hiroshima. They were sent to Hiroshima, and then of course because they're soldiers, they didn't stay there. They went back home, and then they were.
Ran, I'm so sorry. Your microphone.
Yeah, my mic. Yeah, all right. And then they were victims again of Fukushima. Right? But we don't hear their stories because there is no acknowledgement of the military. Now, this is not done on purpose. I hope it's because they were not in Hiroshima, so people in Hiroshima could not interview them. But no one goes out actively, for the most part, and try to get their stories, because it's convenient to focus on civilian victims, to focus and you still see it in memory culture. It's very civilian focused, and it forgets the military completely. And
Yeah. That is so true. There is so much concentration on the mobilized students who are
yeah,
obviously victims of the war. They were
yeah,
forced to work for the military, but you're right. We don't hear the survivor stories of the actual soldiers, right?
it's very hard to find. I have a couple of accounts that I found, but and my next book, well, my next book, it's going to be about this, about the military, and I've been actively searching for military hibakusha, and there's a lot of reasons why we can't find them, like the chaos in the end of the war, the demobilization, uh, but after when he started compensation records, they started to come out more and more. But again, ideologically, the peace movement doesn't really talk about them, right? Because again, it really doesn't fit into the story. It focuses on the students and the kids, and of course, those are doesn't mean they're not victims, right? It doesn't mean, but again, it's much more complex than just a story that starts in August 6th in the morning. Right? This is how both stories starts, right? In the morning of August 6th, civilian, think about Barefoot Gen and those stuff, like a civilian city. That there's some military in Barefoot Gen, but their family is very anti-war. It's very, not very reliable, I would say. But it's the story, right? Of a civilian city, people wake up in the morning and a bomb dropped on them from nowhere, right? Genbaku ga otosara. They always say it in passive, right? I mean, who dropped it? Why just dropped it? What was the context? And that's something that in this book and my other work I try to address. Again, doesn't cancel out the victimization and the horrible stories, but it does need to be put in a bigger context.
Yeah, and that's one of the most powerful stories when you talk about the maidens who
Yeah,
were survivors of the bomb, and they went to America to get plastic surgery to
yeah,
get some of the scars and scar tissue taken off. And the pilot of the Enola Gay who dropped the bomb said sorry and got really upset,
yeah.
and that was a really awkward moment because it wasn't supposed to be about that.
He
It
was
was
also very drunk. Yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
So there's,
yeah.
I
So
really want to send people to read your articles and read this book because there is so much
thank you.
more in here. Um, so many great and important stories. And you're continuing to research and write, right?
Yeah. As long as I'm lucky enough to get paid
It's
to do it,
ongoing. Yeah.
I'm going.
Great.
Yeah.
Great comment here from Kyle. Thank you, Joy and Rand, for the insightful discussion. Difficult issues, but you help by talking through the history. Definitely something we want to talk about more, although it is very difficult. We really appreciate all the work that you continue to do, Rand.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. I guess so. If we have a little bit more, there's a question from Alicia about Nagasaki. Um, I didn't mention Nagasaki a lot now. I'm not a historian of Nagasaki. I'm a historian of Hiroshima. Therefore, I talk mostly about Hiroshima. Nagasaki experience is different in many ways. There's, of course, a lot of similarities. There's a great book. There's a lot of work in Japanese. It's a great book in English and chat dial about it, but how it's almost always in relation to Hiroshima. Um, Again, it's a very complex story that didn't make into the book, and I let others write it. But we also, of course, have to acknowledge it. Hiroshima doesn't stand for Nagasaki. Nagasaki has its own history, its own experience, and I really wish people and people want to read about it. There are great works about it out there.
Yeah, wonderful. And if you are visiting Japan, I would definitely recommend you come to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The experiences are very different. And we have in Hiroshima, 80% of our visitors are from English speaking countries, America,
Yeah,
Australia, and Europe. Much different from the type of visitors that visit most sites around Japan. So
yeah,
the tourism aspect is really interesting and unique. And I'm so glad that you have researched it for so many years and
yeah.
helped us understand it a bit better, Ren. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to talk. Sorry about the mic and.
No, no, I'm sorry too. I really hope you'll join again, and maybe next time we can focus on the castle and the
Oh,
castle history.
yeah, I don't think 1 hour will be enough for me to
Yeah.
talk. Yeah, I can probably also talk to Oleg. It will be great if we can talk a lot more about it, because it will also go back from a different angle to a lot of things we talked so far,
I
specifically
would
those
love
where.
to. Yeah, let's continue the conversation next time. I love it.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Good.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks everyone for
Bye.
joining. Take
Thank you.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye.